Hello, my name is Flojaune Cofer, and I'm the Director of State Policy and Research for Public Health Advocates. And unfortunately, when I first gave this talk at the Health and All Policies event at the California Endowment on August 23rd, there was some trouble with the recording, and so it did not take. And so we've been asked to record our presentation so they'll be available to you. So I can't recreate the magic from that day, but I promise to try to do my best in webinar format for you to be able to see the presentation. And if there are ever any questions, my contact information is in the presentation. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if there's any follow-up. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and we'll get started. I'm hoping you'll still be able to see my face even while I'm doing this. Okay, so the title of my talk that day, and I co-presented with Ken Epstein, who did a great job, and I think you've already had access to his presentation. And so the title is Institutional Barriers to Racial Equity and Community Trauma. Okay, so I frequently like to start my talks by using a fictional example because I think it's really helpful for people to understand sort of what we're going to talk about today and some of the concepts. And so I'm a huge nerd. Nerds often tend to overthink their entertainment, and so the same is true for me when it comes to Star Wars. And so for those of you who haven't seen Star Wars, all you need to know for this to make sense to you is that there's a kid named Anakin who grows up to be the primary villain in the movies, and his name is Darth Vader. And if you get that part, you'll understand exactly what we're talking about. For those of you who have seen the movies, thank you. You will also be able to kind of get some of the little nuggets from the movies, and you'll never see the movies in the same way again. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So when we think the early life experiences and even the preconception experiences of Anakin's parents and that formed his own, birth and early childhood, he ends up being born a slave and he has an absent father. So we already know some of the things that may have precipitated those experiences. And then in his childhood, he remains a child slave, and he's taken from his mother to be trained as a Jedi at around age 10. And because of this, he experienced abandonment and heightened arousal and a real fear of loss. And so when he reaches adolescence, he finally actually has some protective factors. He had a trusted adult relationship with Obi-Wan Kenobi. He has a Jedi education, which we all agree is one of the foundational principles of resilience and upward mobility. Same thing is true for that trusted adult relationship. We have entire programs that are founded on that, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, mentorship programs to instill someone in a person's life to be a constant force. And then he's free from slavery, which I hope we all can agree is a protective factor. At the same time, though, there are additional risk factors that he accumulates during this period. He is exposed to violence via the Clone Wars, and he's taken from his family. And so then his adulthood looks a lot like we might expect for someone who has accumulated more risk factors in their early life than they have protective factors. He has an unplanned multi pregnancy. Spoiler alert, that's Luke and Leia. He lacks trust. He has corrupting influences, Sith Lord Sidious. He has domestic violence in his marriage to Padme. He's severely burned, the Death Star explodes, there's ongoing war, and he prematurely dies. And I know a lot of people are saying, what do you mean prematurely dies? I told you I'm a nerd, and all of that text that is often scrolling by at the beginning of each movie tells us how much time has elapsed between the films. And so, all told, that guy at the end of episode 6, who is supposed to be Darth Vader revealed, is only 45 years old. And I have to tell you, I'm only 35, and I do not want my 45 to look that bad, okay? I'm vain enough to admit that on tape a second time. That is just not the way I want it to go. But it does kind of explain a concept that Dr. Arlene Geronimus has advanced of weathering, that when you have this accumulation of risk factors and traumas and triggers and stressors throughout your life, that it can cause your telomeres to shorten and actually lead to premature aging. And so while it may have just been, someone in the story continuity department didn't notice that the guy that they cast is only supposed to be 45, the truth of the matter here is that in real life we see that weathering that happens to people who experience a lot of these things over the course of their life. But what really always stands out to me when we think about trauma is that This is exactly how stories are told in real life. For those of you who haven't seen the film, the original trilogy came out in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was episode 4, 5, and 6. And so we spent 3 episodes asking ourselves one simple question. How did this guy get to be such a terrible villain? He's choking out stormtroopers. He's creating all this chaos. How did he get to be so bad? And then we actually have to wait, almost 30 years for them to reboot the franchise and do episodes 1, 2, and 3 to find out what happened, to find out his early childhood story, to piece together what got him to the place where he was this villain when we had heard that he was supposed to be a Jedi and that he was one of the best Jedis and that he was so strong. What made him go to the dark side of the Force? And I think that's an important reminder for us that the story of how people got there is incredibly illuminating because it highlights for us the opportunities for prevention, but it also tells the story of humanity. It reminds us that villains are not hatched, they're created. They're not born, they're created. And so much the same way, we need to think about how we can do prevention in public health. So this brings us to the concept of adverse childhood experiences. And the story behind these is actually, an unusual one. It didn't start in social services or, in thinking about early childhood development or any of the usual places you would expect something like this to appear. It actually started in an adult obesity clinic in Southern California. And Dr. Folletti was treating patients, and once they started losing weight, they were not following along the steps that you would expect for people who had experienced early success. You would expect that to be a motivation for them to continue on toward their goals. And instead, they were dropping out of the program or rapidly gaining the weight back that they had lost. And so when they started to do some additional research to find out why this program that seemingly was successful at first was not successful over time, what they unearthed was a history of childhood abuse, specifically physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And that in our culture, we ignore the bodies of very large people because it is impolite to discuss people who are heavier. But the moment that you lose enough weight for people to notice, the first thing we do in our society is say, oh my gosh, you look so good. How much weight have you lost? What are you doing? People may start to make passes at you and may make sexual advances or romantic advances. And suddenly, for somebody who's experienced that type of abuse, they weren't feeling safe anymore. And so this program was not working, not because of calories in or calories out or needing to adjust any of the macronutrient formulas that had been put together to be able to help people lose weight. It was actually not being successful because their emotional safety was violated the more successful they were in the program. And so Dr. Folletti went to present these data to some other physicians, and luckily there was an epidemiologist there. Shout out to my profession. And the epidemiologist, Dr. Anda, said, I think you're onto something, but you need more than just a sample of significantly obese people. You need to do this in the general population because I think you're onto a real trend. And so Dr. Folletti said, I have tons of people. I work at Kaiser in San Diego. And so that's where the first ACEs study was born. 20 years ago, back in 1998, looking at 17,000 patients in Kaiser. And this population was whiter than the general population, was more likely to be insured by their employer because this is before the Affordable Care Act. And so anybody who was in Kaiser at the time likely was there because they or their spouse or their parent had a job. Actually, not even parent, because the 26, the ability to have insurance until 26 didn't come along to the Affordable Care Act. So likely they or their spouse were insured by their employer. They were more affluent, more likely to be college educated, all of these, social protective factors again. And what we found was that 60% of this population had at least one adverse childhood experience. And almost 20%, around 18%, had 4 or more. And these were measures of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, and they were associated with in a dose-response relationship, meaning that the more of the childhood traumas you experienced, the more likely you were to experience these behavioral, physical, and mental health outcomes. And these included things like severe obesity, and diabetes, and depression, and cancer, and stroke, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, as well as behavioral things like smoking and alcoholism and drug use. And so what was interesting about this is many of these things are behavioral outcomes or physical or mental health outcomes that are associated with diet, and exercise. And we often chalk them up to people either being indulgent when it comes to the drug and alcohol use, or lazy when it comes to the diabetes and heart disease and whatever else. We never thought about them being associated with things that have happened in childhood. And Dr. Folletti said something really impactful. He said many of our these intractable public health issues are people trying to come up with their own solutions for traumas and triggers that happened in childhood that we have not addressed and that are not socially acceptable to talk about. And if you think about most of the things here, that's absolutely true. That we don't talk about our parents with mental illness, that we haven't created a space for people to talk about the fact that somebody in their household was incarcerated or was abusing substances, or that the parents were getting divorced, or that there was domestic violence in the home. That we don't talk about the physical and emotional neglect, and certainly not the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And for that reason, it still happens, and people have to deal with it, and so they are finding their own ways of coping. They are self-medicating or coping in ways that may also put their health at risk. But then we have to think beyond just what was happening in the household, because we also recognize that there are community experiences that can be adverse and that create trauma. And so we call that community trauma. And these are things like racism, like natural disasters, like school shootings. Like, these are the things that are happening in the community that make people feel unsafe. And we have to acknowledge that they're happening. We have to acknowledge that there's an epicenter when these things happen in the community that are limited term, and then it ricochets outward into the community. So when there is a police shooting of an unarmed Black person, certainly that family is directly impacted, and they are the epicenter. But then it ricochets out into the community and makes them feel unsafe as well. And so, in Sacramento, there was a young man who came to an event after Stephon Clark was killed back in March. And he said, adults always get on us for being in the house and for not being outside and playing and doing all of these things they want us to do. And the guy said, but when I'm inside playing Call of Duty or playing Madden, I feel safe. No one is harassing me because of what I look like. No police officers are stopping me and asking me, where do I belong here, and wanting to frisk me or wanting to search me or wanting to ask me questions. I feel safe. I don't feel like I'm under attack. And so, yes, I'm not outside playing like the kids of yesteryear did, but this is where I feel safe. And part of that is because he doesn't feel safe in his own community because of some of the traumas that he's experienced. And so we have to acknowledge and respect those feelings. So the bigger question, though, is why does this happen, right? Like, why is it that these things that happen to us don't just roll off of us and go away? And a lot of that has to do with our fight or flight response and what stress is. And so when we experience traumas or when we experience other stressors in our lives, whether it's an upcoming deadline, it could be a short-term stressor, or whether it's something like we talked about with the adverse community experiences or adverse childhood experiences, this cascade of events happens where the hypothalamus causes the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which activates the pituitary gland, which then releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then activates the adrenal gland, which releases cortisol, which we all know as this big, stress hormone. And then that activates our cardiovascular and immune system. And that's where the fight or flight response comes in, where we either decide we are going to square up and fight the bear, evolutionarily, that's trying to attack us in our little village, or we are going to run, beat Usain Bolt at the 50-meter dash, 100-meter dash to get away from the bear. Those are typically our options. And so for that reason, you want your heart to be beating, and you want, you want to be able to breathe well, you want to be able to do all these things so you can perform physically at your maximum ability. You also want your immune system to be activated, because if you happen to square up on a bear, not your smartest thing to do. And likely that bear is going to get some licks in, right? You're fighting a bear. And so you want there to be, your immune system to be activated so that you will stay alive and won't die of an infection or some other complication before maybe medical help can get there to be able to save you. And so that is your fight or flight response. That's why it exists. That's why you hear stories of a 120-pound mom who lifts up a car to get her trapped child out from underneath it. Mom never worked out a day in her life and could barely carry her own groceries. But that's the fight or flight response. It allows you to be able to perform to your maximum when you need it. So typically, when those short-lived traumas go away, when you meet your deadline and you hit send on your grant, whatever happens, you go back to normal because that stressor has gone away. But the challenge is when the stressor doesn't go away and when that stressor is chronic. The other challenge is when you don't have ways to be able to deal with that stress. Those two things can create something called toxic stress. And toxic stress is particularly problematic because it is essentially like driving your Honda Civic at 160 miles per hour everywhere you go. A Honda Civic is not a Maserati. It is certainly a fantastic car. It's a reliable car. You can drive those cars for 20 plus years. But the truth of the matter is, it is not a Maserati, and it's not meant to be doing shifting and drifting all over California roads. And so if you were to drive your Honda Civic at 160 miles per hour all the time, it would eventually destroy your engine, and you would need a new car. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're in toxic stress, is your body is designed to be in fight or flight for limited periods of time to keep you alive, literally so that you live long enough to propagate the species and we don't die off. But when you're in chronic stress, your body is driving around that Honda Civic at 160. And the Honda Civic can get to 160 every now and again. That's why it's on the speedometer, but it's not meant to stay there. And so that's really what's dangerous. And so we either want to have resilience and coping mechanisms to be able to deal with the stresses in our life, and or coupled with removing those stressors so that we don't stay in chronic stress. And so the impact of this chronic stress on our brain development and regulation is that it changes our memory and concentration. It makes us more likely to forget, and it makes it harder for us to concentrate. And the reason for that is evolutionary, programming, that fight or flight response, that if you have this terrible experience, it is not in anyone's best interest for you to remember that moment of your life in vivid detail every single moment of the day. But then it's non-specific, so you can't remember that moment, but you also start to forget other things, right? And so then when you're a student and you're in class and you can't remember what the teacher talked about the day before and there's an exam, well, now that's maladaptive. Now that's not going to work because of the social circumstances you're in. But your body dulled your memory and concentration as a way to protect you from the trauma you experienced. Sleep disturbances. If you are experiencing homelessness and you're sleeping in an unfamiliar place or on a park bench or in a car, it's probably not a good idea to sleep soundly through the night and not hear if anybody approaches you or not hear if there's a noise or a sound. But then we also know that having chronic sleep deprivation can cause the cognitive deficit of being drunk. And so you have people who have not been drinking walking around with the cognitive equivalent of intoxication and the subsequent impairment. And so that's, again, a maladaptive response because of the social circumstances, but your body's doing it to protect you. Or hypervigilance. If you're a foster care youth, and you have been just removed from your home and you're in a new placement, given everything you likely experienced in your home to precipitate that placement, it's probably not a good idea for you to trust and openly embrace every person you run into. You are now in uncharted territory, and you need to be a little bit vigilant. You're probably going to be hypervigilant. But the challenge is that we need each other. And so many of the resilience factors are about having social support. And so if you go to the place where you're hypervigilant and it's really hard for you to form attachments and trust, you're not going to also get the social support you need to be able to be resilient and move through some of those challenges more quickly and get to what we call tolerable stress, which is the idea that we can't remove all of the stress from your life all the time, but we can make sure that those stressors are in context and that you have the resilience factors in place to be able to deal with them. And then there's self-control. If you're in a home that is physically violent, you may need to be ready to fight. You may have a lower threshold to be ready to fight than some of the rest of us, because that's your way to keep yourself or maybe even a parent safe if there's physical abuse happening in the home. But then when you're at school and somebody says something to you and you punch them in the face, that's now maladaptive. You can't punch other kids or other people in the face when you're out in the rest of the world without consequences. But that's that same ability to be able to know when things are about to change and to strike quickly is the thing that's keeping you alive at home. And so all of these things then make it so it's hard for you to connect with other people. It's hard for you to thrive. These are the things that your brain is doing to protect you. But at the same time, they also can have really significant consequences. And so it's important for us to understand that it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you that allows these other things to happen in your life. So for these reasons, trauma has to become a priority. Emotional safety has to be considered in our policy priorities similar to other basic needs, because it is a risk factor for physical and mental health outcomes. And so when we look around and we see air and sleep and food and clothing and shelter, we prioritize those. We understand that we need them to be able to live. But we also need to recognize that we are evolutionarily programmed to detect danger and to respond to it in much the same way our bodies respond when we don't have enough air, or we don't have enough sleep, or we are, are left unprotected because of clothing and shelter or lack of food and water. But then, as we talked about the adverse community experiences, it's important for us to begin to understand sort of how sometimes the identity-based community traumas are formed. And so Renee Myers has a book called The 25 Habits of Culturally Effective People. The big title is What If I Say the Wrong Thing? And what she goes through is this chart that we've adapted here of historically advantaged and disadvantaged groups in the United States. And obviously these would differ if you go to different places, and even within the U.S., there are places where certain groups are large enough that you may not experience that as a one-down community, or you may be experienced even as a one-up community. But for the most part, this kind of holds as the people who have been advantaged and disadvantaged in the U.S. And so, using myself as an example, I am a Black woman, and so I have a one-down identity when it comes to race, ethnicity, and color. I'm a dark-skinned Black woman, and as well as gender. But I also happen to identify as straight, and I was raised in a Protestant home. And my socioeconomic class is that I am, upper middle class and managerial, and I am college educated, and I went to top 20 to 40 schools, and I was born in the U.S., and I speak English, and I'm an able-bodied person. And so all of those things are also privileges. And so I am going to walk through the world very differently than another Black woman who happens to be LGBTQ, happens to not be Christian or Protestant, happens to to have less money, or maybe even be in a service position, happens to not be college educated, happens to have been an immigrant, happens to not be a native English speaker, happens to have physical or mental disabilities, right? That person is going to, yes, we're both Black women, but we're going to experience this differently. And so we do need to understand intersectional identities, while also recognizing that when we first show up in the world, people are going to respond to both of us as Black women. And so even though we're not moving through the space as the same Black women, we also do have those commonalities that we share, and that are going to color our experiences and give us some shared ways of seeing and thinking and being as well. So it's important for us to recognize that our privilege may make us oblivious to the ways that our behavior could be exclusionary, to the challenges that we don't face, and to the ways that our comments could offend or injure someone. Because privilege is often this idea of thinking something's not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. Or even the luxury of not considering a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. And the best example for this, again, I like to use myself, is that, I'm an able-bodied person. I can run, jump, play. I'm a runner. I'm a very able-bodied person. And it does not always occur to me when we're scheduling events how somebody who has a physical disability is going to navigate. If the elevator is broken in a place where we are out of service, I don't think about that as I don't immediately think about that as a barrier, because I'm an able-bodied person and I can very easily take the stairs. I don't think about how far it's going to be for you to park and have to walk to be able to navigate a space, or how wide the doors are to be able to, or are there chairs that don't have don't have handles or do have handles so that somebody who's in a wheelchair will be able to do their own transfer. That's not something that immediately has to come to mind for me, because I don't have to do those things. And so if we're thinking about choosing a venue and I don't consider those things, that's a privilege from me, right? I don't face that challenge, and my behavior in terms of choosing a venue that's not easy to navigate could be exclusionary. And if I don't prioritize that, my comments could offend or injure someone. And so that is a privilege that I have with one of my identities. And we all have those privileges based on where we fit and what our identities are. And so we need to be at least cognizant of the fact that that may happen. It helps us better navigate. And so when we're having these conversations about race, we all have to engage, but we do have to engage differently. And there is often a tendency when we begin to talk about race, which we are going to do a bit here, for people of color to often feel like they have to take care of white people, and that they have to kind of tamper down what they were going to say. And then there also sometimes is this tendency for white people to personalize things and say that wasn't their intention, or to resist the label of racist, or to resist acknowledging that things may be experienced differently. And so I'm just calling out some of Ken Hardy's work and saying that when we're having these conversations within organizations, we need to be mindful of that. We need to think about the fact that we often all think about our subjugated self. So I do often think about myself as a Black woman, and that it doesn't immediately come to mind that I happen to be a straight Protestant Black woman with a lot of class privilege and even immigration status privilege and physical, ability privilege. And so for that reason, we need to begin to think about ourselves, not only from our subjugated selves, but also from our privileged self. And it changes the way that we enter into a space, and the way in which we want to be regarded when we're thinking about our subjugated selves. It's also the way that we should consider regarding others when we're having these conversations. So there's this concept of implicit bias, and implicit bias is essentially these attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And the key thing to understand about this is that they can be favorable or they can be unfavorable. So it can make you biased towards a certain group, or biased against, right? They're activated involuntarily, though. And so these are things that you're not often even aware you're doing. And the big thing is that because they're activated involuntarily, they don't necessarily reflect our declared or stated beliefs. So you may see yourself as a progressive person who really wants to be egalitarian and understands social justice, is committed to this work, and does good public health work and all of that. And yet at the same time, because you live in a society where racism is at the forefront and also undergirding a lot of the ways in which we are stratified, but you have picked those things up, and they may form some of your implicit biases. And implicit biases often favor the dominant group because things like racism are social constructions of both economic and social value. And so it means that there is more money in looking more like the people in power. There is also, more social privilege in looking like the people in power. And so I show these pictures here to just remind us that if you were to see each of these people dressed differently, you would have a different, impression of them, even though they're the same person. And so if you can recognize how you might see these three people on a street, depending on the context, and view them differently, you also then can recognize that if you saw each of these three people separately, you also would have a different impression of them based on their race, their gender, and how they're dressed. And so those are the things that we're bringing up when we're talking about implicit biases. The big thing to understand, though, is that they are malleable, which means that the more you know, the better you're able to navigate them. And so this is not an opportunity where you would say that ignorance is bliss. Actually, ignorance is a way for you to not navigate your biases and to be able to perpetuate them further. So how are our biases shaped? I mentioned, that we grew up in this culture, and so we're taught all these messages. And certainly we know from the doll test that's been done with African American girls over the span of 50 years, that these little girls at 2 and 3 are pointing to the white doll and saying she's good and she's clean and she's pretty, and pointing to the black doll and saying she's ugly and she's bad and that's not the one that they want. And they're not living in households where people are saying these things to them outright, but they're picking up on the messages of who is important and who is privileged in our society. And so I brought up these two more recent headlines to be able to give examples of how this plays out in our media. So on the left, we have the Washington Post headline from when Stephen Paddock committed a horrible atrocity in Las Vegas and killed over 50 people and injured many more. And the headline is, Las Vegas gunman Stephen Paddock enjoyed gambling and country music and lived a quiet life before massacre. And then on the right, you have Tamir Rice. The headline after he was killed, and Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old black boy in Cleveland who was killed by the police while playing with a toy in the park, and the police, got out of the car and shot him pretty quickly without issuing any commands. And he was alone, and he was playing with a toy. And so the headline is, Tamir Rice's father has a history of domestic violence. And then there's an update that says, a line has been added to this story to give insight into the motivation to investigate the parent's background. People from across the region have been asking whether Rice grew up around violence. And if you're paying attention again, Tamir Rice was killed while playing alone in a park with a toy. He was not killed by his parents. He was killed by the Cleveland police. So the relevant question here is not whether or not he grew up around violence, but whether or not the officer grew up around violence. because the only person who was being violent in this situation that resulted in this child being dead was the officer. But if you compare these two headlines, what you see is an attempt to appeal to the humanity of Stephen Paddock. We're talking about, you know, him enjoying gambling and country music and living this quiet life. And a Twitter user named Megatron aptly pointed out that white privilege is getting a massacre obituary that doubles as a dating profile. Because it certainly seems like somebody who you might want to hook up with one of your single relatives who has similar interests. And then to contrast that with the parents who are dealing with the death of their child and are essentially having their background being drugged up as a way to be able to say that this kid either deserved to die or was on his way to becoming a menace. And so we really shouldn't care that much about this kid because he came from a lot of chaos. And we're bringing up, you know, facts about his parents, you know, lives that are wholly irrelevant to the case at hand. So once we've kind of talked about how our implicit biases are formed, now we have to talk about racism. Because racism is related to, but not the same thing as implicit bias. Implicit bias is, again, often unconscious, and these ways in which we favor or do not favor others. Whereas racism is quite different. And there are 4 types of racism. The first is personally mediated racism, and that's when we have acute stressors, including personal insults or discriminatory acts that you are using against someone based on how they look or their membership or affiliation with a certain group. And this is what I like to call Disney racism, because even a 3-year-old can identify it. It's just that, I mean, it's very clear what it is. And sometimes that's where our understanding of racism ends, but there actually are other types of racism. Another one is internalized racism. And this is when we begin to believe the negative stereotypes about people of our own race or ethnicity. And that it affects our self-esteem and our feeling of our intrinsic worth. You see this happen a lot in schools where, you know, where there's something called stereotype threat, where Black and Latino students are more likely to perform poorly when given a task. They have to write down the race or ethnicity first, because it conjures up these feelings that this task is going to be used as a way to be able to assign intelligence to their race or ethnicity, and they're aware of all these stereotypes. And so it creates a stress response that causes them to often perform more poorly than they would if they weren't asked that question in advance. And then there's cultural racism, which determines which group qualities or characteristics are valued or devalued. And the best example I give of that is that there are only 12 countries on the entire planet that have not been colonized by Western Europe. And so because Western Europe has occupied as a great economic and social power, that most of the world's population sees white skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes as a beauty norm, even though for most of the world's population, that would not be an appropriate beauty norm, because most of the world's population does have browner skin and browner eyes and browner hair. But people have assumed those qualities as being valued because they have economic and social value because of who's in power because of colonization. And then lastly, there's institutionalized racism. And this is where we have policies and practices that can be formal and informal that determine who has access to resources. So the best example of this is the practice of redlining, which was done between 1934 and 1968. And it was where the Federal Housing Authority gave neighborhoods a rating from A in green to D in red, and then B was blue and C was yellow. And it was essentially a grade of proximity to whiteness. That the A neighborhoods were almost entirely white. They were places where mortgages were backed and they were heavily invested. And B neighborhoods were ones that were still mostly good, but had more undesirable people, maybe Catholics, maybe Irish, before they became part of the white population for those who were, and that sort of thing. And then C neighborhoods were starting to now be taken over by what were perceived to be undesirable communities. And so this is where, you know, Asian communities often lived, and where Latinos were sometimes glad to live. And there may even have been Black people living in some of the C neighborhoods. And then the D neighborhoods were comprised, the majority of which were comprised by Black people and or other people of color who were considered undesirable. And so those red lines were drawn around the map, and it was said, don't invest in these communities, don't back mortgages here. We are not going to do a lot for these communities because they are definitely declining, and they are not places that we want to heavily invest. And so this practice was done for 34 years. And as a result, even though the practice ended 50 years ago, As recently as 2010, there were still differences apparent within the boundaries in terms of the levels of racial segregation, the levels of home ownership rate, the home values, and the credit scores. And what's really interesting is that among the D neighborhoods, over 80% of them are still predominantly Black. And of the A-rated neighborhoods, 91% are still middle class or upper class neighborhoods, and 87% are still predominantly white. 50 years after this practice ended. Why? Because it was institutionalized. So once it ended, we just said we won't do this moving forward. We didn't move anyone. And so I actually had a coworker that I used to work with who brought me the deed to her house after I gave this presentation and showed me that on the deed to her house, right in Davis, it said this house cannot be sold to Mexicans. And her parents bought this home during redlining and passed it down to her, and she will then pass this house down to her kids. And that's an accumulation of wealth that her parents bought that house for somewhere in the $22,000, $23,000 during redlining, and that house is now worth $1 million. And I'm sure that there is a Mexican family somewhere in California who would have loved to have had the opportunity to buy that house during redlining and pass it down to 2 generations and have it be worth almost $1 million now. And they were systematically denied that opportunity because redlining was in place and those provisions were enforceable when it happened. And nobody's going to come along now and say you got to give the house back and let it go to somebody else. And so that's 2 generations of accumulated wealth that didn't happen. And so these things still pass along. And for a long time, how do we fund education? We funded it by the tax base of the neighborhood. But we know that this is still happening, right? We know we did nothing about it. How do we fund our cities? We fund it through the tax-based, property taxes, right? And who has the higher property taxes? And where is that money going to be spent in terms of districts? All of these things are remnants of a practice that was institutionally racist. And so it doesn't matter if you have a lovely, board of supervisors and a great city council and a fantastic mayor, when their work is the foundation of their work is on top of these racist policies, you're still going to see differential outcomes. So I say all of that, and it's really depressing. You think to yourself, okay, well, we're not moving anybody around, so what do we do? Well, equity looks a lot like offering access, right? It's creating the ability for everybody, using this example, to be able to see the baseball game. And so we often use, these images where we show the 3 people at the game, one's an adult, 2 children, and we give them all the same thing, 1 box, and the adult who could already see has a better view, and the kid can finally see, but the youngest child is just looking at the fence. And then we talk about equity being stacking the boxes differently. So the youngest kid gets 2, the middle kid gets 1, the adult gets none, and everybody can see the game. And that's fantastic. But how about we stop stacking boxes? And how about we just tear down the damn fence? And if we do that, then everybody has access to be able to see the game from wherever they are. And that's an idea of liberation. And so what we're going to be doing now is talking about how do we transform our institutions? Because when we talk about institutional racism, we all work within institutions. Gare is thinking about institutions, and so you all are the institution. So instead of trying to fix property taxes, unless of course that is your field, if you're in housing, by all means, try to fix some of these things. But if you're not in that, if you're working for social services or public health or whatever else, we're going to ask you to do what they do when you get on an airplane, which is to secure your mask before assisting others. And so we want you to look within your institution and say, what are the ways in which you are institutionally racist and encouraging these biases within your own functioning, and let's fix those. And once you do that, you will do a much better job implementing all the programs and services that you're supposed to do with the outward community. So the first thing that we're going to ask you to do is change the frame. We want you to look within your organization for structural barriers, and we want you to spot patterns, to identify problems, to train champions, and to develop solutions. So that's the first thing we're going to ask of you. And so to do this, you're going to have to mine the data. Going back to Brene Myers and that chart we had, you're going to look and have to see, internally, are 1 down staff leaving your organization at the same level? Are they underrepresented or absent from leadership? So do you have a great, after school special looking diversity panel of people at the lower ranks, but your leadership of your organization is entirely homogenous? Are they only working on specific programs? Do you only let Latinos come in to do Latino outreach? Are Black people only allowed to come in and work for the Black Infant Health Program? Are there ways in which you have shepherded people and limited and isolated them from opportunities within your entire organization? Are they expected to do all the unpaid and diversity and mentoring work? Are they, making sure that they're on your diversity team and on your equity team and doing all of this work that they're not being compensated for, but that is supposed to be mission critical to the work that you're doing? And then, have you burned them out? Are they overrepresented on medical leave? Because those are some of the things that you can notice and begin to say, we may have a problem here. Externally, is your organization partnering with community members from one down communities? Are you trusted within those communities that are affected by whatever issue you're working on? And are you addressing structural barriers in your external work? And if you're not doing these things, likely you have a problem both internally and externally. So then we have to spot the problems, right? Now that we've looked at the data and we see, oh gosh, some things are really challenging within our organization. There are some typical things that happen because there's this political cartoon that says, who wants change? Everybody shoots their hands up. And it's like, who wants to change? Everybody's hands are down and they're silent because change is hard. And we all want to see change, but we don't want to be part of the people who have to bring about that change. And so some of the common problems are mourning the good old days, right? Not really wanting things to change because who wants change? Who wants to change, right? And then there's also mistaking the mirror for merit. And that's in-group favoritism. It's assuming that people who are like you are hardworking and deserving and have merit, and therefore prioritizing them in your hiring processes, in your promotion processes, and even in who you give opportunities to be able to demonstrate that they're warranting promotion. And so we have to be really clear on, does the work that you're doing require a college degree? Or is that something you've included because you have one and you like being around other people who are like you? And so thinking really about one of the good places to do that is when you look at the requirements for a job classification and saying to yourself, are we allowing the people that are critical to this work to be able to come in and do it? And if you have too many qualifications, but you need community outreach, you may be systematically disenfranchising the very people you need to be successful. And then you have to go out and partner with them, but there's no money because you're already paying somebody who doesn't have those skills internally. So you have to think about, how do you bring people in? And are you only allowing opportunities for people who are like you because they're like you, but not because it's essential to the work? And then there's the one mistake rule, right? It's, the unfair criteria of it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. See, I told you she wasn't ready for leadership, when really you didn't set that person up for success in the first place. You didn't give them what they needed, or you were just waiting for them to make a mistake, and instead of providing some support and leadership and additional training, you were ready to write them off immediately because you mistake the mirror for merit and you were just waiting for them to prove you right. And then there's also the low standards, the patronizing. So not giving, as I said, opportunities to somebody to be able to shine, and then saying, well, they're not able to do it because they haven't been given opportunities, and all you've ever asked them to do is go get your coffee. And they seem to do that really well, but you're not sure if they can handle a whole case file. Well, you haven't given them one case to see if they can handle that, to be able to demonstrate to you what they can do. So those things are often the things that show up in organizations and that people are often unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge are happening. I mentioned the book earlier, What If I Say the Wrong Thing? 25 Habits for Culturally Effective People by Renee Myers. The next thing is training champions and getting started. This book is really short. It has easy to digest chapters, and I highly recommend it for anyone who is trying to have these conversations within their organization. There also are other things that you can read up about, especially when it comes to thinking about race in the world. Debbie Irving, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Ta-Nehisi Coates. The other thing, we talked about implicit bias, and having people do the Harvard implicit bias test online. It is free, and it helps to illuminate your biases, not just about race, but about gender and about body size and about a host of other domains where you may have biases that you should be aware of. And so in doing this, you're developing within your organization a common language and understanding for the work that you're doing, and it's really fantastic because then people are able to participate in a way that will allow them to advance the work because you have this shared understanding. And then you also have to develop solutions. And so the best practices have to be institutionalized and sustainable. So it's not enough to have a very charismatic leader at the top of your organization who thinks this is important. And then once that person takes another opportunity or decides to retire, that the work completely goes away. You have to think about your internal policies and practices and ways in which this work is going to move on no matter who is there. Because equity will actually look and sound different. So if you're expecting this to come in and you're just going to paint all the people who were there brown and expect your organization to become, you know, suddenly transformed, that's not the way it's going to be. These people are going to come in with different experiences and other ideas for how to do things. And so you're going to have to make sure that you're committed to that process, not just in name only. And then you're going to also have to pay attention to the details. And I say the bathrooms because when Harvard first, joined with Radcliffe and became a co-ed institution, they were really excited about having all these women, or so they said. But then when the women showed up on campus, they didn't have any facilities to use. And that's a prime example of bringing people in, but not really readying yourself for the fact that something's got to change, and you want to be inviting and welcoming to them. And so pay attention to the ways in which you are expecting people to come in and adapt to your culture, and whether or not you're making room for them to shift your culture and for the culture to be influenced by their presence. So you should not require people to come in and emulate what's already there. If you really want this to be an equity-focused organization, you have to be willing to bring people in and allow them to participate as well, and that to be transformed by that shared process. And so you want policies that promote equity, not just equality. And so you really want to start with, as I said, institutional change, systems change, to avoid reinforcing your institutional biases. And so we've talked about some of the things like hiring practices and setting people up for success by giving them stated criteria for evaluation and opportunities to thrive and shine. And so those are some of the creative problem-solving ways that you can begin to address solutions. But it's helpful first to know what the problems are, to spot the patterns, and then to be able to do some training and think about what you're going to do, and then develop your solutions. And your organization certainly can change. So I always end with this. Anytime we're talking about making institutional change, is, what's the next step? Well, the next step is to think about stop, start, continue. What are you currently doing that you're going to stop doing because you know it's not working? What haven't you done that you will start doing because it really may work? And what are you already doing that is a key to success that you're going to continue doing because it works really well? So I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much for participating in this webinar. I am sorry that you weren't able to see it the first time I gave it, but I hope I gave it the same amount of enthusiasm and energy this time, even though we are recording online. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I work for Public Health Advocates. You can always find a way to get in contact with me, FC, like Flojaune Cofer, at phadvocates.org. You can also find me on Twitter at Flojaune, which is FLOJAUNE, or at WeArePHA. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of your day.